Resumes. Questions without notice. Senator Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. How many years has the coalition government presided over record low wages growth?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. I thank Senator Gallagher for her question. The government, which we have been proud to serve and deliver for Australians a strong economy in the lead-up into this global economic crisis, pandemic-induced crisis that we face, has worked tirelessly to create more employment opportunities for more Australians and have achieved that in record levels. We acknowledge indeed during that time that inflationary factors, including wage factors, have been at relative lows. They have been at relative lows both together, noting that the inflation factors have also been at lows, and so nominal wages growth has been at lows alongside low inflation growth. But what our government managed to achieve, Mr President, in the run-up to the last election was growth of 1.5 million extra jobs in Australia. 1.5 million additional jobs for Australians, giving them every opportunity.
Senator Birmingham, Senator Gallagher on a point of order.
Point of order is relevant.
I'm actually trying to hear the point of order.
There was no preamble, Mr President. It was a very direct question about wages growth. How many years have they presided over record low wages growth? And the minister should be relevant to the question.
I can't instruct the minister how to answer a question, nor the terms in which he can answer it. When the minister, I've allowed you to remind the minister of the question, Senator Gallagher, when the minister's talking about wages growth, and I would contend that includes being able to glance across, as he just was, issues of the labour market, as long as he relates it to wages growth. I cannot instruct him how to answer a question or the terms in which to answer it, but talking about wages growth is directly relevant to the question. Senator Wong.
If that were the case, we would agree, but he's not. He's talking about jobs and other economic parameters, and a glancing, if I may, my submission is, a glancing reference doesn't then justify a range of material which is simply not relevant to the question.
Okay. In my view, Senator Wong, the minister was, to use the colloquial phrase, glancing across. I heard him turn to this just around the 1 minute mark, so less than 15 seconds in a 2-minute answer. I do consider to be glancing across issues of the labour market when they're made directly relevant to the issue of wages growth. I will listen carefully and let the minister continue. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. And indeed, Mr President, I'm more than happy to talk about wages as well as jobs. The two are firmly connected. Now, real wages have increased in Australia over the past year. Wages price index growth of 1.4% has outpaced inflation of 0.7%. I was pointing out earlier in the answer, Mr President, in addressing this, is that inflation rates have been at incredible lows. And so with inflation low, unsurprisingly, Mr President, so too have associated wages rates. But, Mr President, what we have done and what achieved the economic strength for Australia was achieve record jobs growth, which of course feeds into wages pressures.
The answer has expired. Senator Gallagher, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Yes, I do have a supplementary. On Tuesday, the RBA Governor warned of, and I quote, subdued increases in wages and prices over coming years. Will Australian workers have to endure a decade of low wages growth under this government?
When will
wages growth return to trend?
My apologies. Senator Birmingham.
Well, Mr President, it's important, and I thank Senator Gallagher for at least using all aspects there of a quote, recognising that the RBA Governor was noting anticipated low prices growth as well. So low prices growth, low inflation environment does of course mean that you would, well, those opposite like to come in here, and of course what they frequently seek to do is talk about the nominal rates and the nominal rates in relation to wages. We face at present a global economic situation quite unlike anything the world has seen in the last 100 years. our country has responded more strongly and better than most. But we acknowledge there remain difficulties across the economy for many businesses, for many households. But yesterday's growth figures, welcomed by the RBA Governor who you quote, who has endorsed strongly the approach the government has taken in terms of our policy settings, are all about getting people back to work and driving growth across the economy.
Senator Gallagher, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Given that the government has prioritised spending $15 million worth of taxpayers' money, congratulating itself on its so-called comeback marketing campaign, when will Australian families, under mounting cost of living pressure, finally experience a wages comeback?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, our absolute focus is on driving strong economic growth across the economy to get growth in all quarters for all Australians. And our focus and what we are achieving in that regard has clearly been about getting the growth that delivered yesterday, impressive economic figures for Australia. Economic figures that demonstrate yet again our country is outperforming much of the rest of the world. We went into this pandemic in a stronger position than much of the rest of the world because we had been outperforming in terms of jobs growth, because we had outperformed in terms of budget management. We went in with resilience and strength, and we are now coming through this pandemic in a better position than most of the rest of the world, not just on the health outcomes, but on the economic outcomes, which are closely tied to one another. And so, Mr President, we clearly are committed and will continue to implement the policies that deliver the economic growth like that we saw yesterday.
Birmingham. Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister for Families and Social Services, Senator Ruston. Can the Minister please update the Senate on what the Morrison government is doing to remove barriers to employment for people with a disability?
The Minister for Families and Social Services, Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and thank Senator Hughes for her question. Well, the Morrison government is absolutely committed to challenging misperceptions about people with disability and promoting a more inclusive Australia. In this financial year alone, we will be spending around $34 billion on programs and services to support and improve the lives of Australians who live with disability. And today, being International Day of people with disability, it's timely to reflect on the contribution of the more than 4.4 million Australians who live with disability. It's about celebrating their lives, their achievements and their contributions. It's also an important opportunity to mark the contributions that people with disability make to the workforce and to focus our attention on making sure that we change the attitudes of our employers so that they understand that people with disability can be a really strong asset in so many businesses around our country. So I'd encourage employers, not just today but all year round, to see the ability in disability and hire based on what people can do, and in doing so improve the job opportunities for people with disability, and understanding that people with disability are missing out on jobs because people just don't think. This needs to change. And today, can I acknowledge the pin that I am wearing was designed by Oliver Mills, and I noticed that a number of my other colleagues are wearing it too. He's a 32-year-old man from Adelaide who lives with cerebral palsy, epilepsy and vision impairment. But that's only a small part of Oliver's story. He's also written 4 books. He's an artist, a poet and a speaker. And we cannot overlook these talents and experiences of people like Oliver and the contribution that they make to Australian society. So today, on the day of International Day for People with Disability, I encourage everybody, I encourage our communities, our workplaces, our schools to participate in International Day of People with Disability.
Senator Ruston. Senator Hughes, a supplementary question.
Can the Minister advise how the Morrison government's 2020-21 budget is helping people with a disability to get into the workforce?
Senator Ruston.
Mr President. Well, we are investing more than $3 billion into disability employment services over the forward estimates. Changes announced in this recent budget mean that investment in disability employment services will be better targeted, working to assist job seekers most in need of specialised assistance to ensure that they can be supported in the workplace. We're also investing an additional $45 million in the individual placement and support program, which will now expand out to 50 sites across Australia. The IPS program co-locates vocational and other support services with youth mental health services through the Headspace program. And it focuses on the need of young people, making sure that we support them either remaining in education or getting into employment, and making sure that the young people are accessing the services that they need to enable them to be able to do that. So by offering early support, we hope that we'll be able to set up these people for a lifetime.
Senator Hughes, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. What is the government doing to support people with a disability that are employed within the Australian Public Service?
Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Well, we all know that a job is an absolute game changer in anybody's life, and it shouldn't be any different for somebody with a disability. As a nation, we need to rise to the challenge of improving the employment outcomes for people with disability, and that starts with the Australian Public Service setting an example. So the Australian Public Service currently employs 4% of people with disability, but I'm really pleased to say that the department of which I have the pleasure of being the Minister, that figure sits at 6.8%. And today, I'm pleased to announce that we've released the new Australian Public Service Employment Strategy to make employing people with a disability a mainstream activity in the culture of the Australian Public Service. And only this morning I had the pleasure of meeting Nick and Gordon, two fantastic young men who work at Services Australia. And in speaking to their supervisors, they said that they are some of the best employees they have had, and their work is outstanding.
Senator Wong.
Thank you, Mr President. On Monday, my question is the Minister representing the Minister for Government Services, Senator Ruston. On Monday, the Minister said that as soon as the government became aware, and I quote, that the method of debt collection was not valid, we immediately ceased collecting funds. End quote. Can the Minister advise on what date the Morrison government first became aware that the method of debt collection was not valid?
The Minister representing the Minister for Government Services, Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and I thank Senator Wong for her question. And just in the interest of being absolutely clear about what I said on Monday, and I accept the direct quote that Senator Wong has just read into the Hansard, but what I would say is what I said on Monday was that income averaging was deemed to not be a valid method by which to determine a debt. And so we just need to be very clear that it was not what Senator Gallagher alleged that I had said, and that was that the income compliance program was not valid. So just to be absolutely clear. Absolutely clear. Senator Wong, as is always the case in this place, we do not, and it's been the practice of everybody, whether it be the Labor governments or successive Liberal governments, that we do not provide details in relation to specific legal advice. However, I do stand by my statement that as soon as we were made aware, we acted with great speed to make sure that we did not continue to use income averaging as the sole method by which we would determine debts. In fact, we made it very, very clear that we would make sure that we had further proof points in determining if a debt was raised. And so that to ensure that the income compliance program was collecting or was determining debts by a valid means. And as I subsequently went on to say during the week, that we have now this year proceeded to repay the debts that were generated through income averaging as the sole means for collecting those debts. We have now gone through the process of repaying the majority of the debts that were determined by that means.
Senator Wong, a supplementary question.
Supplementary question, and I refer to the Minister's answer. I'm not seeking legal advice. The Minister herself has made a public statement, including to this chamber, that the method of debt collection was not valid. She herself has indicated that. I'm not going to the substance of legal advice. I'm asking this government when you became aware of the method of debt collection being not valid. What was the date?
Senator Ruston.
very much, Mr President. Senator Wong would be well aware that the matter that we are referring to is actually still before the court. And for me to come in here and to provide information not only about the legal advice but the dates when it was received. However, what I can tell you is that, last year that we made a decision that we would include an additional proof points to enable us to make sure the method by which debts were calculated was valid, and that was undertaken at that time.
Senator Wong, final supplementary question.
Can the minister explain why this government ignored warnings over 3 years prior to late 2019 and at least 76 AAT decisions and continued with a method of debt collection which was not valid?
Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Well, I reject the premise of the question that Senator Wong just put to me, because as I have said in this place, when I became aware, or the government became aware, that the method of the income averaging as a method for determining debts was not a valid means by which to determine those debts, we changed the program to ensure that we did not continue to be determining debts by this invalid method. However, when you go back to the comments in relation to the AAT, as I've said in this place this week on a number of occasions,
Senator
each
O'Neill.
and every case that goes before the AAT turns on the specific facts of that case. There were cases before the AAT that were upheld, and there were also cases that went before the AAT.
Sorry,
that were
Senator
overturned.
Canavan, on a point of order.
Look, on a point of order, Mr President, and this has been happening all week, it's hard to hear the answer to this question with Senator O'Neill's constant interjections, and I would like to be able to hear interjections equally. I can't hear Senator Keneally's interjections over Senator O'Neill's interjections, and I think it would only be fair
Senator
if they'll give
Canavan.
equal opportunity to interject on these important questions.
Order. Senator, I'll take Senator Wong on this or another point of order. Senator Wong.
On this point of order,
Senator Wong.
On this point of order, I would have hoped Senator Canavan might care a little more about the fact that this minister is entirely refusing to be accountable
Senator Wong,
to the
that's not a point of order. That is not a point of order. Interjections, I will restate, are always disorderly, and I ask senators to allow their colleagues to hear the answers to questions so they may be debated after question time. Senator Ruston, have you continue? Senator Ruston's concluded her answer. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham. Today, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, called on the world to make peace with nature and to address the climate emergency. He said, quote, "The state of the planet is broken and humanity is waging a war on nature." Secretary-General Guterres has called on nations to be more ambitious. The planet is already sick. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, meanwhile, is fiddling around with dates in the second half of the century to reduce carbon pollution to net zero. The goalposts have shifted. Net zero by 2050 is no longer enough. Does the Prime Minister know this? Does he understand that we need net zero by 2035 or earlier? And what is the Prime Minister doing to address this crisis and this war on nature?
The Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President, and I thank Senator Hanson-Young for the question. It is tempting to refer her to the answers that I've given during the course of the week to Senator Waters, and I forget which other Green senators have asked almost identical questions. I think Senator Faruqi asked a very similar question.
Senator Rice.
So, Mr President, let me again remind the Green senators in relation to Australia's position that we have committed very clearly to the Paris Agreement, to reduction targets under the Paris Agreement, and to deliver those targets and indeed strive to exceed those targets as we have done in relation to our commitments under the Kyoto Protocols, Kyoto Protocols 1 and Kyoto Protocols 2. Our effort to date in terms of emissions reduction is real and world-class in terms of the level of those emissions reductions. If you take examples of reductions between 2005 and 2018, Australia has achieved 13% reduction in emissions. Compare that with others: Japan at 8%, the United States at 10%, New Zealand at 1%, Canada at 0.1%. Our emissions reduction activities have been clearly delivered, and our approach is to continue that. You asked about plans. Our approach is to continue to achieve those reductions through our investment in technology, rather than the type of taxes or other mechanisms that the Greens, of course, would love to see applied. Our approach is to back technologies, to work with counterparts around the world like the United States in terms of investment in technologies along our tech roadmap, to build upon the partnerships we've struck in new technology areas like hydrogen with countries like Germany, like Japan, like Korea, to drive investment in those spaces and to achieve positive outcomes that continue that track record of emissions reduction.
Order. Senator Hanson-Young, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, it's this type of faffing around, lack of action, that the General Secretary calls is suicidal. That is the truth here. What is your government going to do? We need net zero well before 2050, and you don't even have a proper 2030 target. What are you going to do?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, we're going to keep implementing the policies that have been driving down Australia's emissions already. I just outlined the extent to which Australia has been achieving real reductions in our emissions relative to 2005 levels, compared with other countries not meeting the same scale of achievement by Australia. What are we going to do? Well, over the next decade, our government will invest $18 billion in low emissions technology. Out of that, we're going to leverage $50 billion worth of new investment. This is all about getting the technology points like hydrogen or carbon capture and storage or otherwise to the financial tipping point where they are not only used and adopted in Australia, but they're economically viable for other countries. Because you know what? We're not going to see transformation in terms of China's emissions or India's emissions or other countries' emissions without cost-effective technological solutions. That's why we're investing in it, to get solutions here that can also be adapted in other countries around the world to fix what is actually a
Senator
global
Birmingham,
problem.
time for the answers expired. Senator Hanson-Young, a final supplementary question.
Thank you. Will the government cancel the surplus Kyoto credits, as countries like the UK, New Zealand and Germany have already done? Or will you continue to, so they cannot be used now or in the future? Or will you continue to hide, to squander and to faff about while the planet burns?
Senator Birmingham.
Well, Mr President, let me try to give a little bit of an explanation about why it is that Australia has surplus credits.
Yes, please.
You know why we have surplus credits, Mr President? Because when it's come to the first Kyoto commitment period, we overachieved. We overachieved. We made a commitment to the world that we would reduce our emissions, and we did so not only by the margin we'd promised, but by more than that. And that generated a surplus. And guess what's happened with the 2020 target, the second Kyoto commitment period? We made a commitment to the world again that we would reduce our emissions. And we met that commitment. And we overachieved. We overachieved for a second time. And so that is why Australia has carryover credits. You know what other countries do? Other countries don't achieve the emissions reductions in their own country and go and buy credits from elsewhere around the world. We've achieved the reforms in Australia, overachieved. That's why those credits exist.
Senator Birmingham. Senator, order. Senator Sheldon.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Senator Cash. Can the Minister confirm that Qantas has received more than $1 billion in taxpayer-funded support since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, including hundreds of millions of dollars of JobKeeper wage subsidies?
The Minister representing the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr President, and I thank Senator Sheldon for the question. Senator Sheldon, what I can confirm is that we're in the middle of a global pandemic and that many industries across Australia have been hard hit, and I do acknowledge that the aviation sector in particular has been hard hit. And as a result of that, you are correct. The government has provided industries and employers with support, whether it's by way of JobKeeper or the plethora of other policies that we have put in place. I am also, like you, Senator Sheldon, and like my colleagues on the government side of the chamber, we are saddened with any job losses as a result of the global pandemic, and including those job losses that have recently been announced by Qantas. Without a doubt, it has been a tough year for the aviation sector. It has been a tough year and a long year. And in particular, as you know, Senator Sheldon, because of the fact that our international borders remain closed and our domestic borders are only now really reopening up, and they will continue to reopening, are we seeing more flights in the air? But Senator Sheldon, our government, we have taken extensive action, as you know, to support the aviation sector to the extent possible, bearing in mind the extent of the global pandemic. And in fact, Senator Sheldon, you would be aware that support to Australia's aviation industry now totals more than $2.7 billion. But, like any industry or in Australia and employers, you are right. We have, as a government, provided them
Order,
with
Senator
support.
Cash. Senator Sheldon, a supplementary question.
Despite receiving more than $1 billion in taxpayer support, Qantas has outsourced a further 2,000 jobs. Does the government support this decision by Qantas?
Senator Cash.
Well, Senator Sheldon, again, the government's been very clear from day one. Any job lost as a result of COVID-19 is an absolute tragedy.
Order.
But this is a decision, as you know, it is a commercial decision for Qantas, and Qantas are entitled to make those decisions. But, as I've also already said, I have some statistics, Senator Sheldon, in relation to stand-ups and stand-downs. This actually shows the effect of the global pandemic on the aviation industry, but also what we're seeing. As borders reopen, aviation companies are able to bring, as you know, their staff
Order.
back
Senator
on.
Wong on a point of order.
Actually, the question related to outsourcing. I'd ask the commercial
Order.
decision. Okay.
Have you concluded your answer, Senator Cash? Senator Sheldon, the final supplementary question.
Since March, the government has allowed Virgin to fall into administration while giving Rex millions of dollars in untied grants, enabling them to expand their routes, given some aviation companies access to JobKeeper while abandoning others like Donata workers, and sat back while Qantas has sacked a further 2,000 workers. What does the minister have to say to the Qantas workers in the gallery and the building today who have lost their jobs?
Senator Cash.
Well, Senator Sheldon, as I have said, as the Prime Minister said, as my colleagues have said, any job lost as a result of COVID-19 is absolutely devastating. The aviation industry has been hard hit as a result of COVID-19, and that is why the government has provided extensive support to the aviation sector after what I acknowledge has been a very long and a very tough and a very difficult year.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is for Senator Payne, Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will a prisoner swap between Australia and Iran, as happened last week, start a new trend of Australia negotiating with terrorists, moving away from the proclaimed position of never negotiating with terrorists?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne.
Thank you, Mr President, and I thank Senator Roberts for his question. Last week, Australia was able to welcome the return of Dr Kylie Moore-Gilbert to Australia after more than 2 years in detention in Iran. These are deeply complex, very difficult matters to deal with in any international context, and even further complicated by the impact of a global pandemic. Australia worked for many, many months, across 2 years, to secure the release of Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, and a range of diplomatic discussions and exchanges between international partners are held at times such as this to pursue those matters. I will not go into further detail on those issues, but I am very pleased to be able to say to the Chamber that it is an enormous relief to have been able to welcome Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert back to this country last week. We know that Dr. Moore-Gilbert was imprisoned
Senator
in Iran.
Roberts, on a point of order.
Yeah,
Senator...
point of order, Mr President. I asked about the proclaimed position of never negotiating with terrorists.
Senator Roberts, you had a preamble, and the minister is being directly relevant to the question in addressing that part of the question as well. Senator Payne.
Thank you, Mr President. As I said, we never accepted the charges upon which Dr Moore-Gilbert was purported to have been detained and ultimately sentenced, convicted and sentenced. In that context, we continued our negotiations. We will not go into the nature of diplomatic discussions with other countries. Our role is to protect the rights, the freedoms, the safety of our citizens in the national interest, and that is our absolute focus. We consistently advocate in favour of the international rules-based order, and we fundamentally oppose coercive diplomacy in any of its forms.
Senator Roberts, a supplementary question.
We too are concerned about preserving the rights and freedoms of Australians, and with that in mind, if more Australians are taken as hostages again in future, how many more terrorists will Australia need to set free to gain their release?
Senator Payne.
Thank you, Mr President. We are very concerned about the use of arbitrary detention in a number of places around the world. We have engaged with international counterparts in relation to those matters, particularly counterparts in the UN Human Rights Council and in the United Nations context. I'm working closely with my Canadian counterpart in particular on these issues. And it is always a matter of concern when Australians travel to countries where issues such as this also are referred to in our travel advice explicitly and openly. We recommend strongly that Australians who seek to travel to such places, notwithstanding the fact that the current travel advice continues to be do not travel in the context of COVID-19, we recommend strongly that that travel advice is read and observed. We form the advice through our Consular and Crisis Division, Senator.
Senator Roberts, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Does this promotion of Australia's release of 3 terrorists in a hostage swap constitute providing support to a terrorist organisation, which may constitute an offence under Section 102.7 of the Criminal Code Act 1995?
Senator Payne.
No, it does not, and I reject the premise of Senator Roberts' question.
Senator McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Treasurer, Senator Birmingham. Can the Minister please update the Senate on how the Morrison-McCormack government's economic and health response to COVID-19 is supporting Australia's employment and economic recovery?
Minister representing the Treasurer, Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. I thank Senator McKenzie for her question, and I know her concern for Australians right across this country, city and metro and regional, in terms of their health and economic well-being through what has been this most remarkable year around the world. And indeed, Australia has and continues to perform better than most other countries in terms of saving the lives of Australians and saving the jobs of Australians. It's been an incredibly tough year for many people across Australia, and an even tougher one for many people across the rest of the world. But yesterday's national accounts have shown that in Australia, real GDP increased by 3.3%, the largest quarterly increase since 1976. Of course, it came off the back of a significant decline in the previous quarter. However, when you look around the world, the decline Australia faced was less than most of the rest of the world, and the recovery is stronger than most of the rest of the world. And these are the defining factors. It is a work that is ongoing work. It is going to be a long road back for all countries around the world in terms of the recovery from here. But over the last 5 months, we've seen 650,000 jobs created, 344,000 of those filled by women, 226,000 filled by young Australians. We welcome this incredibly important progress in terms of getting Australians back to work and the decline in the effective unemployment rate from 14.9% to 7.4%. Our economic recovery plan outlined in the budget this year are programs to enable profitable businesses that are previously profitable for loss carrybacks, our investment deductions, our bring forward of tax cuts, our plans around home builder are all about the next stages of recovery over the months and years ahead to keep getting more Australians back into the workforce and to drive those numbers back to where they were in the past,
Order.
back into
Senator
the future.
Birmingham. Senator Mackenzie, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you for that comprehensive answer, Minister. How has the government's record economic support through the COVID-19 pandemic protected Australians' livelihoods and kept Australians connected to jobs?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, $257 billion in economic support from the government, $130 billion of it already flowing into the pockets of households and businesses, has been crucial to maintaining and keeping business capability, businesses afloat, and therefore, of course, Australians in as many jobs as possible. Programs like JobKeeper, the Job Seeker Supplement, the cash flow boost to businesses, the two $750 payments to millions of pensioners and others on income support. These have all been crucial support that have kept almost 3.8 million Australians connected to their employer. The Reserve Bank estimating at least 700,000 Australian jobs saved that would otherwise have potentially been lost without these types of programs in place. Our supporting apprentices and traineeships wage subsidy has helped over 57,000 small and medium businesses to save again around 100,000 apprentices and trainees to keep them in jobs, crucial saving of jobs throughout
Senator
this
Birmingham.
year.
Senator Mackenzie, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. As Australia enters a new phase of our COVID-19 recovery, how will our Liberal and Nationals government support Australians back into work, back into training and empower local communities, including in regional areas, to deliver tailored responses to our communities?
Senator Birmingham.
Mr President, so many of our programs have been supporting right across the economy and the country, but our local jobs program is putting boots on the ground across 25 regions, targeting particular support for employment, funding local jobs plans in collaboration with local stakeholders, employers and training organisations to help make sure the jobs growth in those sectors and regions is as strong as we are trying to drive right across the whole country. Our JobMaker hiring credit benefits right across the country, supporting 450,000 young Australians back into work. Our boosting apprenticeship commencements wage subsidy will help support the training of a new generation of 100,000 apprentices and trainees across Australia, but especially in regional and rural Australia, giving these apprenticeships and young Australians maximum opportunity to get a job in the regional areas, to stay in those regions, to contribute to their growth and their opportunity, and ultimately to generate even more jobs into the future.
Senator Birmingham. Senator McKim.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Home Affairs, Senator Cash. Senator, I refer to the generous offer from the New Zealand Prime Minister to resettle refugees and people seeking asylum who've been detained by your government on Manus Island and Nauru. After over 7 years of misery, suffering and uncertainty for thousands of innocent people who have committed no crime, will your government finally accept this kind offer from Prime Minister Ardern and give people the freedom and safety they so desperately need and deserve? And if not, why not?
The Minister representing the Minister for Home Affairs, Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr President. And Senator McKim, you did mention Nauru and Manus Island, and just for your benefit, because clearly you've forgotten why people are on Nauru and Manus Island. So just to remind you, Senator McKim, it is because you supported the failed border protection policies of the former Labor government. You see, colleagues, when we came
Point
into
of order. Senator McKim on a point of order.
Well, predictably its relevance, President, and yes, the word Nauru was in my question, but the history, the sordid and shameful history of Australia's offshore detention policies is not relevant in any way.
I'll make the rulings if people don't mind. On the point of order, a small amount of historic context is directly relevant. It would not be appropriate for it to form the bulk of the answer to the question, nor a substantive part of the answer to the question. But I think it is reasonable to have some historic context, but to be directly relevant, it must directly address a substantive part of the question. So you've reminded the Minister, Senator McKim, and I call the Minister to continue her answer.
And thank you, Mr President. And as I was saying, the only reason Senator McKim is able to ask his question today is because he supported the failed policies of the former Labor government. Senator McKim, in relation to, though, the New Zealand refugee resettlement offer, the Prime Minister and the Minister for Home Affairs have made it very clear we appreciate the offer from the New Zealand government to resettle refugees. However, as you know, Senator McKim, we remain focused on completing the United States resettlement arrangement. You clearly know the answer. You're sitting there shaking your head. The US arrangement, Senator McKim, for your benefit, is actually progressing well. It is actually progressing well, with 876 refugees resettled to date and further departures expected in the coming weeks and months.
Senator McKim, a supplementary question.
Thank you, President. Minister, why is it that your government insists that the US arrangement must run its course before engaging with the New Zealand government in response to their offer? Why must people wait longer than the 7.5 years that they have already been detained? Has your government not heard, and does it not have the capacity to walk and chew gum at the same time?
Senator Cash.
Well, unfortunately, Senator McKim, in answer to your question, and colleagues, I'm going to have to go to the statement or the question by McKim, does your government have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time? Well, the answer is yes, Senator McKim, because clearly we showed that when we came into office and we actually stopped the boats coming. Because you see, Senator McKim, you supported failed policies. And as such, when we came into government, we had to clean up the mess that you created. Just let me remind you, Senator McKim, 50,000 people arriving on more than 800 boats, 1,200 lives, Senator Hanson-Young will remember this well, 1,200 lives tragically lost at sea. Over 8,000 children were detained whilst Labor were in office, in government. In July 2013, just a reminder, Senator McKim, 10,201 people in detention, including, Senator McKim,
Order,
almost
Senator Cash. Time for the answer
children.
has expired. Senator McKim, a final supplementary question.
Thank goodness for that, President. Minister, I note the findings of the Australian Human Rights Commission's report released today, which notes grave concerns for the physical and mental health of the 196 refugees and people seeking asylum who were transferred to Australia from Papua New Guinea and Nauru for medical reasons. When will you finally give these people freedom and safety and end their prolonged and heartbreaking suffering?
Senator Cash.
Well, thank you, Mr President. Well, the Morrison government, we will never apologise for protecting Australia's borders and restoring integrity to our borders. We will never apologise for that, Senator McKim. In relation to the report that you refer to, you'd be aware that the Home Affairs Department has responded to it and has agreed with 9 of the Commission's recommendations. But, Senator McKim, what you also failed to advise the Senate was the Commission importantly notes that the reduction in the number of children in detention, which peaked at almost 2,000, under those opposite, that the Commission actually acknowledges that reduction. Mr President, this is also what Senator McKim has failed to tell the Senate. Overall, we've reduced the number of people in detention by 85%, more than 10,000 under your alliance to just 1,500 now, and more than 70% of those in detention, Senator McKim, have a criminal record.
Senator Keneally.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne. On the 18th of September, the Prime Minister promised that 26,000 stranded Australians registered with his government at that time that they'd be home by Christmas. Can the Minister confirm that in the 76 days since the Prime Minister made that promise, only 14,000 people on that list have made it home?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Keneally, for the question. Mr. President, the challenges for many Australians overseas are well appreciated by the government. This is a very difficult time, and the impact of the pandemic is not, as it would be easy to say or think, past. It is in fact a matter with which many countries around the world continue to grapple with at the most difficult level now. So the health and the safety of Australians abroad and at home has been the government's #1 priority in these difficult and unprecedented times. We are very aware that many Australians face hardship overseas because of the global travel restrictions that are resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are helping vulnerable Australians, Mr. President, by facilitating access to flights to Australia, by providing financial assistance where required through the hardship program which we announced some months ago, by continuing to provide a professional and responsive consular assistance to those in need. Since the National Cabinet meeting, Mr. President, on the 18th of September, where the Prime Minister indicated that of the 26,000 Australians then overseas, we would endeavour to bring as many of those Australians back to Australia as we could, we have seen 40,800 Australians return from overseas, including more than 16,000 Australians registered with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Of those, over 3,500 were categorised as vulnerable. Mr. President, since the government advised Australians to return, more than 432,000 Australians have returned to Australia.
Payne. Senator Keneally, a supplementary question.
Thank you, and I note the Minister's response that 16,000 of the 26,000 have come home. Given that the Prime Minister's only got 7 days for the 10,000 stranded Australians who were registered with DFAT on the 18th of September to be with their families on Christmas Day, what hope do those 10,000 stranded Australians have that they'll be able to celebrate Christmas with their families in Australia?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me just clarify, Senator, I said that since the National Cabinet on the 18th of September, over 40,800 have returned from overseas, including more than 16,000 Australians registered with DFAT. That is not necessarily specifically of the 26,200. There will be a component of the 26,200 plus others. I will get the Senator that other number. Mr. President, I know that Senator Keneally and those opposite have been discussing these issues for some time. In fact, I understand Senator Keneally's interview with Mr. Fordham this morning referred to this. And it is clear that those opposite do understand the process of national caps and the management of the quarantine and the number of arrivals that restricts us in dealing with in Australia. And we are working closely with the states and territories in relation to that, Mr. President, because we know what happens when quarantine goes wrong.
Answer has expired. Senator Keneally, a final supplementary question.
Thank you. Dave and Kate Jeffries have been stranded with their young son Mitchell in Canada since their return flights were cancelled in March. They've had their travel plans disrupted and their flights cancelled multiple times. Will the Prime Minister deliver on his promise to the Jeffries family to have them home by Christmas, or will he leave them behind?
Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are doing everything that we are able to do within the flights available, the quarantine places available within the caps, to bring as many Australians home as we can. As many as we can. And since that meeting on the 18th of September, 40,800 Australians have returned from overseas.
I very much hope, Mr President, that families such as the one that Senator Keneally has referred to are able to do that within, and we will continue to provide them with appropriate consular support through this process, because it is a very difficult situation, Mr President. We are dealing with, as I have remarked before and as I know others have remarked, a global pandemic which has impacted our ability to return Australians from overseas. It's impacted by flights, it's impacted by quarantine space. We have opened Howard Springs. We have accommodated 500 Australians in returning Australians in Howard Springs as part of that process.
Senator Bragg.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Cash. Can the Minister please update the Senate on a global search for a COVID-19 vaccine and how it will impact Australia's health response?
The Minister representing the Minister for Health, Senator Cash.
Thank you, Mr President, and I thank Senator Bragg for the question. And I'm pleased to obviously update the Senate that the Morrison government welcomes the emergency approval given to the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine in the United Kingdom. This is particularly so given the over 1.6 million cases and the tragic loss of over 59,000 lives in the United Kingdom. This emergency approval is not a full public authorisation. However, it does allow the United Kingdom government to deploy the vaccine as quickly as possible to specific groups of patients, such as frontline healthcare workers, people over the age of 80 and aged care residents. This emergency authorisation is in response to the very high disease load in the United Kingdom at present. It is understood that the emergency use authorisation, the vaccine, will not be generally available to the wider United Kingdom population. In terms of Australia, Pfizer continues to work with the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, providing data for safety and efficacy as part of the approval process. Our advice remains that the timeline for a decision on approval is expected by the end of January 2021, and our planning is for the first vaccine delivery in March 2021. Pfizer, of course, is one of 4 vaccines the Australian government has purchased for a total projected supply of around 134.8 million units. In addition, we will have access to up to 25.5 million units under the international COVAX facility. Safety is, of course, though, Mr President, our #1 priority, and Australia is well placed both for a thorough but rapid safety assessment and early rollout of a free, voluntary but universally available COVID-19 vaccine program.
Senator Bragg, a supplementary question.
Should a vaccine
Order.
prove safe and effective, how has the government's vaccine strategy positioned Australia to roll out a vaccine in 2021?
Senator Cash.
Well, Mr President, the Morrison government has made a $3.2 billion investment in advance purchasing agreements with 4 vaccine manufacturers, AstraZeneca, CSL, Pfizer and Novavax. We've contracted for, as I've already stated, around 134 million vaccines directly, in addition to another 25 million units of vaccine through the international COVAX facility. This means Australia has secured enough supply to vaccinate Australia many times over, subject to success and approvals. Our medical experts have identified the class of vaccines that we need. The vaccines we have secured amongst the most advanced, and it is increasingly likely that all of our contracted vaccines are on the pathway to being successful, safe and effective. Australia actually has high vaccination rates, with over 94% of Australian 5-year-olds being vaccinated each quarter this year. Australia, Mr.
Senator
President,
Cash. Senator Bragg, a
positioned.
final supplementary question.
Thank you. How will these investments continue to support Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how is Australia positioned compared to other countries to face the challenges of COVID-19?
Senator Cash.
Well, Mr. President, more than $18.5 billion has been committed to support the emergency COVID-19 health response to the pandemic. When we do look at, though, the situation here in Australia, compared to other nations, we are performing remarkably well. Just in terms of a global update, there have been over 63 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally and over 1.4 million deaths in total. In Australia, we've had 27,923 confirmed cases and sadly 908 deaths. Whilst we can never be complacent, the systems we have in place have resulted in lower loss of life, lower transmission rates and lower economic impacts than in most other countries.
Senator Green.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is to the Minister for Youth, Senator Colbeck. How many young Australians are unemployed?
The Minister for Youth and Sport, Minister for Youth, Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, the youth unemployment rate is too high at the moment, at 15.6%, Mr. President. And so, Mr. President, as we have done through the budget process, through the period of COVID-19, Mr. President, we have put in significant measures. Mr. President, we have put in significant measures to support young Australians. In fact, Mr. President, it's interesting that the Labor Party were only a few weeks ago criticising the government for the range of measures that we have put in place to support young Australians to get back into work as the government and as the economy recovers from COVID-19, Mr. President. So significant resources.
Senator Colbeck, I have Senator Senator Green on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. President. My question didn't have a preamble and it was directed at how many young Australians are unemployed. That's a question about a figure, not a rate of unemployment.
With respect, I don't think it's within my ability to decree that a rate is not directly relevant. There's a time to debate questions. The minister's entitled to order. The minister is entitled to answer in that form, and it was a very specific question, and I will maintain a tight test of direct relevance because of that. As long as the minister is talking about youth unemployment, I do think that is directly relevant. Senator Colbeck.
Mr. President, and I believe I was being directly relevant to the question because I actually quoted the youth unemployment rate of 15.6%, Mr. President, as part of my response to the question. Mr. President, and I've also said that the youth unemployment rate in this country is too high, and the work that this government continues to do to support young Australians to get back into work, because we are concerned that young people who stay out of work too long have significant lifelong effects with respect to their futures, their career, their financial circumstances. So, Mr. President, we have made, through our budget processes and through the pandemic, in supporting people with JobKeeper, in supporting young people with JobSeeker to keep them connected to their workplaces, and then to support them to gain new jobs through our JobMaker programs, our apprenticeship support programs, Mr. President.
Senator Wong on a point of order.
Direct relevance. The minister's been asked for the number. I understand he's now being given the brief. Perhaps you could advise the chamber.
As I said before, Senator Wong, I think answering in this form, I cannot say that is not directly relevant to the question. What I'm being asked to do is to rule on the substance of an answer, which I cannot do. While the minister's talking about issues directly related to youth unemployment, I do think that is directly relevant. Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so this government will continue to do everything that it can to get the 337,200 young Australians who are unemployed back into work, and we'll continue to do that.
Order. Senator Green, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have a supplementary, but I can assist the minister. The latest ABS data reveals that 337,000 young Australians are unemployed. How many of these...
Order. 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 Senators on my right, Senator Wong, one of your colleagues is asking the question. I heard multiple colleagues on my right. Is one of your colleagues asking the question? After you read out the number, I'll let you continue the question if you could start from after you read the number again, Senator Green.
How many of these young Australians are unemployed today as a result of the Morrison government's deliberate decision to exclude them from JobKeeper?
Senator Colbeck.
Mr. President, this government has worked assiduously through COVID-19, through the development and the implementation of JobKeeper, through the development and the implementation of JobSeeker, to assist young Australians to stay in work where they can, connected to their jobs, to support them through the COVID-19 pandemic. And, Mr President, unfortunately the youth unemployment rate over the last period has increased. That's why we put in place measures, Mr President, to assist young people to get work, to attract young people, to attract employers, to employ young people in apprenticeships, Mr President. And only in the last sitting fortnight, Mr President, the opposition were criticising us for focusing on young people and employment as a part of our budgetary strategy, Mr President, but we will continue to do that because we know the negative effects on young Australians if they stay out of work too long. We will continue to support them into new jobs.
Order, Senator Colbeck. Senator Green, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. 337,000 young Australians are unemployed and more are expected to join them in the coming months. How long will it take for youth unemployment to return to pre-crisis levels?
Senator Colbeck.
Mr President, as the economy continues to grow off the back of the release of the border lockdowns that have been occurring, we saw a 3.3% growth in the economy in the recent figures that came forward last week, Mr President. More people will go back into work and they will continue to be encouraged to do by the measures put in place by this government, Mr President, unashamedly put in place by this government, Mr President. Measures that the opposition has criticised us for, measures that the opposition have opposed in this place, Mr President. The youth measures that we put in place, criticised by the opposition, opposed in this place by the opposition, Mr President, but we are proud to support younger Australians and employers of young Australians to bring young people back to work.
Senator Birmingham.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, please.